Hello, and welcome to the Fantasy Rewind podcast. I am your host, Michael Whitford, and I am not joined by my co-host, Dylan Stoll, as he is on vacation. So for this mini episode, I'm going to be doing a deep dive into the character Matthew Cable, better known as Matthew the Dreams Raven, or the Raven, I suppose. I'm going to kind of go through his short but interesting history in DC Comics universe, and just kind of say some things that I think were really good about his adaptation into the series. Now, if you would like us to do other character deep dives, or just have some character suggestions for us to check out, or any feedback of any kind, please feel free to give us a rating and review on Apple Podcasts or any other podcast provider. That helps us out immensely. And you can feel free to reach us at Fantasy Rewind on Twitter and fantasyrewindpod@gmail.com and on Instagram. All right, with that being said, let's go ahead and jump on in here. Now, Matthew Cable, or as he's known in the comics as Matthew Joseph Cable, he first appeared in DC Comics' Swamp Thing series, which I love the Swamp Thing series. I did not read the older runs, though. I read the new 52 run, and I really enjoyed it. But he happened to be introduced in the Swamp Thing Volume 1 in November 1972, and he was then resurrected later on as Dreams Raven in the Sandman series, which is really interesting because he crossed complete comic lines. And in the original Sandman comic series, they did have other DC characters there. They had Martian Manhunter and Superman and, some Justice League members, and John Constantine, obviously. So obviously, this wasn't the first time, and this was kind of a really neat connection to some of the other DC comics within the Sandman series. Now, his biography gets a little wild. He starts off as a government agent, and he's assigned to protect Alec and Linda Holland. Alec Holland, a lot of people know it was the Swamp Thing, or at least it thought it was the Swamp Thing. They were working in the Louisiana Bayou as, on their biorestorative formula. They were killed by this organization called the Conclave. It was sinister, and unfortunately the Hollands were murdered. Then the Swamp Thing rose from the bayou. Cable believed it was initially the thing that killed the Hollands, which is completely reasonable. He went out and he tried to pursue and avenge the Hollands' death. In this search, he ended up meeting Abigail Arcane, who was a friend to the Swamp Thing, and a niece to Anton Arcane. And Anton Arcane was pretty much someone who wanted the Swamp Thing's body, because he wanted to become immortal at the time. And the New 52 changed some of that, but it is really interesting that Matthew Cable ends up marrying Abigail Arcane, who is the niece of Swamp Thing's arguably biggest villain at that point. So eventually he also encountered the Doom Patrol, and he became friends with the Swamp Thing, and so it kind of all sort of worked out in that sense. Eventually, though, Matthew Cable's mind became very damaged, and it gave him the ability to alter reality, which is just insane, right? And because of that, though, his marriage with Abigail began to fall apart. He would abuse his power. He would do some really bad stuff with the things he would do, and it just affected his marriage. And he found that he was able to access his power best when he was intoxicated. And so there was a lot of drinking and a lot of not great things going on. So basically he gets in a fight with Abigail, and she goes to find the Swamp Thing, and he drives after her, but he had been drinking heavily. He ends up crashing his car and mortally wounding himself. Then this gets really weird because he gets in the car crash and he's dying, right? And then Anton Arcane, who had died and he had gone to hell, basically sent a fly to ask him if Cable would like to live, and then it crawled down his throat, and he possessed the fly and then Cable's body, and he with it gains Cable's godlike reality warping powers, which is just insane. Eventually Cable does end up sending Arcane back to hell, and when he does that, his body reverts back to the car crash, and he ends up going into a coma. But before he did this, he ended up bringing his wife back to life after his possessed body by Arcane had killed his wife. So really messed up stuff. And so in the comics, Matthew the Raven talks about like doing bad things, and he wasn't lying. Because once he ends up in this coma, he ends up dying in it, and since he was technically died when he was dreaming in the coma, Dream was able to resurrect him and give him life in the form of a raven. Now, as the raven, there's not really too much that they do. And in the comics, we don't really know much of their purpose outside the fact that they live in Dream's domain. There's only one raven at a time, and they live with Eve. It seems like the purpose is companionship, and I think this is where the show has really turned things up and given Matthew a lot of purpose and given him a clear like relationship dynamic with Dream, and really showing that he kind of balances him out. He gives him someone to humanize him a bit more, and so I think that was really cool. So he's a raven. That's pretty much the end of it. I know it's like, oh, that's not too much, but I think the really interesting thing here is just the history in the comics and how like he went from being this person who was a top spy and then hunting Swamp Thing and then working with Swamp Thing, marrying this woman. He met the Doom Patrol at some point, and then he has this reality warping powers, gets into all this mess by drinking a lot and very heavily and doing some really terrible things, and gets possessed and car crash first, and then gets possessed, and then ends up getting unpossessed after killing his wife, and then saving his wife with his reality powers, and then going into a coma and dying, and then ending up as a raven. Like, his whole journey it's just really wild. So I'm excited to see if they do any callbacks or like the kind of history there for Matthew Cable. But we'll see. Either way, here's hoping to a second season of The Sandman. I hope you guys are enjoying it. Again, would love to do some more deep dives on some characters. If you have some suggestions, would love to hear them. Got stickers we're going to be sending out, and I look forward to sharing those stickers on our social media, so you should definitely go check them out. They're really cool. Yeah. Well, with that, I hope you guys have a fantastic night. This was just a real quick episode, so again, hopefully it's just, you listen and you're done. All right, with that, this is One Nerd signing off. Bye.